What happens when the war stops feeling far away and starts flashing over Moscow at night? And what if this 40-day campaign is not really about one giant knockout blow, but about making Russia feel pressure every single day until something cracks? If you want clear breakdowns without the noise, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with the one friend who always asks, what does this really mean? For most of this war, Russia tried to keep two stories alive at the same time. On the front lines, it wanted to project strength. At home, it wanted normal life to keep moving. Go to work, fill the car, take a summer trip, pretend the violence was happening somewhere far away. But in late June, that second story took a hit. Volodymyr Zelenskyy said he approved a 40-day operation designed to influence Russia and push for an end to the war. That wording matters. He did not publicly promise some magical final strike that would suddenly end everything. He framed it as pressure, sustained pressure, political pressure, psychological pressure, economic pressure. And if you look at what happened around that announcement, you can see why this is such a serious moment. Public reporting in the last days of June described repeated Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian territory and on occupied Crimea. The message was simple. If Moscow keeps bringing the war to Ukrainian cities, Ukraine will keep bringing cost back to Russia's rear areas. Not once, not for headlines, repeatedly. That is why this story is bigger than one dramatic title. It is not only about fireballs, explosions, or social media clips from the night sky. It is about a change in the shape of the war. Ukraine is trying to make distance matter less. It is trying to make depth matter less. It is trying to tell the Kremlin that there is no comfortable safe zone anymore, and the timing is impossible to ignore. Zelensky's statement came as reports pointed to strikes on oil sites, logistics nodes, and infrastructure connected to Russia's war effort. The Guardian reported that he said Russia was moving air defenses to protect places like Moscow, Valdai, and the Kerch Bridge. Euronews reported that Crimea and Moscow appeared to remain priority targets because those are the places Russia seems determined to shield, even if it means weakening coverage elsewhere. That kind of redeployment can change the battlefield without a single dramatic frontline breakthrough. Think about what that means in plain English. If Russia pulls more air defense toward the capital, toward symbols, toward prestige targets, then other regions become more exposed. That creates stress inside the system. Commanders have to choose what matters most. Politicians have to decide what they can afford to let burn, shut down, or stumble. Ordinary people start asking questions. If the state is strong, why are airports closing? Why are fuel lines growing? Why are train schedules changing? Why are blackouts spreading in places Moscow told everyone were secure? That is where this 40-day idea becomes dangerous for the Kremlin. Not because one speech changes the war, not because one wave of drones changes history overnight, but because a steady campaign can chip away at confidence. And in wars like this, confidence is not some soft side issue. Confidence affects markets. Confidence affects local officials. Confidence affects whether people believe sacrifice is temporary or endless. One of the clearest examples is the Moscow oil refinery. Reuters reported, and other outlets later echoed, that the refinery was hit hard enough that it was unlikely to resume production this year. A Ukrainian outlet summarizing the Reuters report said repairs could take at least 6 months. That matters because this is not a random warehouse in the middle of nowhere. It is tied to Moscow's fuel supply. Reports said it covers a huge share of the region's gasoline and diesel needs. So when a target like that goes down, the effect is not only military, it spreads outward. Fuel is one of those invisible things people only notice when it disappears. When it is there, nobody talks about it. When it is not, everything feels broken at once. Transport gets harder. Prices climb. Deliveries slow down. Shortages create panic. Panic creates rumors. And rumors in wartime are their own kind of weapon. That is why Ukraine keeps focusing on the logic of systems, not just the drama of single targets. Refineries, oil depots, bridges, transport hubs, air defenses, radar, ferry routes, rail lines. This is not random. It is pressure on the plumbing of war. And if there is one place where that logic becomes brutally clear, it is Crimea. Crimea matters to Russia for more than one reason. Militarily, it helps support operations in the south. Politically, it has been treated for years as a symbol of permanent Russian control. Emotionally, the Kremlin sold it as proof that history had moved in Russia's direction. So when Ukraine says it wants to isolate Crimea, it is not just targeting a peninsula, it is targeting a narrative. Reuters reported in mid-June that Ukraine's drone commander, Robert Brovdy, said the goal was to cut Crimea off from Russia by disrupting supply routes. Euronews went even further, saying Kyiv's campaign was already choking logistics on the peninsula and that Ukraine planned to fully isolate it. Whether that goal is reached fully or only partially, the intention is now visible. Make Crimea costly to hold, costly to supply, and costly to defend. You can already see the signs. NBC reported that Russian-installed authorities in Crimea announced a state of emergency after suspending tourism, halting children's summer camps, and stopping fuel sales in response to Ukrainian attacks. The report said people were already describing rising prices and long lines at gas stations. The Guardian reported more power outages in Crimea, blackouts in Sevastopol, and cuts to train service. Russia Matters, in a review that collected multiple sources, described rolling blackouts, water pressure problems, transport disruption, and long waits near the Kerch Bridge. That is what a siege looks like in the modern age, not medieval walls, not a single dramatic encirclement. A modern siege is made of shortages, repair delays, uncertainty, and 1,000 little failures that make normal life feel abnormal. And that matters because the Kremlin has tried very hard to tell Russians that annexed Crimea is stable, connected, and secure. But if fuel sales are halted, if tourists start leaving, if ferries are shut, if trains are cut back, if hotels empty out, then the image breaks. Even if Russia still physically controls Crimea, control starts looking more expensive and more fragile than before. Now here is the part many people miss. Ukraine does not need every strike to be perfect. It does not need every drone to hit. It does not need Russia to fall apart in 1 month. It only needs to keep forcing expensive decisions. Every time Russia has to move air defense, repair infrastructure, guard another oil site, reroute transport, calm another region, or explain another disruption, Ukraine creates friction. Enough friction, and even a larger state begins to feel slow. There is also a psychological layer here that may be even more important than the physical damage. When drones approach Moscow, even if most are intercepted, the capital loses something precious, the feeling of immunity. That feeling was politically valuable. It told Russian citizens that the state was in control. It told elites that the center was protected. It told investors and officials that the machinery still worked. Repeated attacks do not have to destroy the capital to damage that belief. They just have to keep interrupting it. Search results from Reuters in late June said Moscow had faced repeated drone waves, with officials reporting large numbers intercepted over and around the capital on multiple nights. Other reporting described airports closing and reopening, emergency services scrambling, and local authorities giving constant updates. Even without full transparency, the pattern matters. The pattern tells you the pressure is regular enough that it can no longer be dismissed as a fluke. And when a state must keep proving it is safe, people start wondering whether it is safe at all. This is why Zelensky's wording about influence is so important. Influence is not the same thing as destruction. Influence is about changing choices. If Ukraine can convince Russian planners that important infrastructure is always vulnerable, then Russia must spend more to defend it. If Ukraine can convince Russian families that the war no longer stays far away, then the emotional distance between the front and the home front shrinks. If Ukraine can convince the world that Russia's rear is more exposed than it looks, then it strengthens the argument that Moscow can be pressured, not just endured. If this analysis is cutting through the chaos for you, press like, subscribe for the next breakdown, and send this video to one person who is tired of shallow war coverage. But we also need to be careful not to slide into fantasy. There is a version of this story that sounds exciting and dramatic and simple. It says Ukraine launches a 40-day campaign, Russia panics, Putin folds, and the war moves toward a sudden end. That is the cinematic version. Real war is rarely that neat. Russia is still dangerous. Russia still has large missile stocks, large drone production, and the ability to hit Ukraine cities hard. Russia may also answer increased pressure with increased retaliation. In fact, that is one of the biggest risks in this moment. A pressure campaign can force the other side to adapt, but it can also provoke it to escalate. That is why the next question matters more than the title of any video. Can this 40-day campaign actually force meaningful change, or will it simply harden both sides further? To answer that, we have to look at three battlefields at once. The first battlefield is military logistics. On that front, Ukraine has a real argument. Repeated attacks on refineries, depots, roads, ferries, bridges, and support infrastructure can make Russia's war effort more expensive and less efficient. Russia Matters cited open-source tallies and outside reporting suggesting Ukrainian strikes were hitting transport networks and trucks along routes tied to Crimea. If those routes keep getting disrupted, Russia must choose between slower logistics, more protection, or riskier movement. None of those options is free. The second battlefield is the economy, and here the picture gets more complicated. Reuters reported in February that Russia's oil and gas revenue for that month was expected to fall to about 410 billion rubles, nearly half the level of the same month a year earlier. Over January and February, Reuters said those revenues were expected to total about 800 billion rubles, down from 1.56 trillion rubles in the first 2 months of 2025. The reasons included lower oil prices and a stronger ruble. Those numbers matter because oil and gas revenue remains a major source of Kremlin income. At the same time, 1 week period does not automatically mean collapse. States at war can absorb pain for longer than outsiders expect, especially when they control the media space, rework budgets, and prioritize defense over almost everything else. Russia has already shown that it can take sanctions and losses and still keep fighting. That is the hard truth. So when people say economic pressure alone will break the Kremlin, history tells us to be skeptical. Still, pressure does accumulate: lower energy revenues, higher repair costs, more damaged refining capacity, fuel shortages, local rationing, price jumps, added security spending. None of these alone ends a war. Together, they can create a heavier and heavier burden. The third battlefield is perception. This is where the 40-day plan may be strongest. Ukraine is trying to shape what Russians think is possible, what elites think is manageable, and what the outside world thinks is sustainable. If the strikes keep coming, the message becomes hard to ignore. Russia can hit Ukraine, yes, but Ukraine can increasingly hit back deep inside Russia and in occupied territory too. That changes the conversation. Instead of asking only whether Ukraine can hold the front, people begin asking whether Russia can protect its rear, its oil system, its bridge links, its Holiday Peninsula, and its image of control all at the same time. And once that question enters the room, it does not leave easily. There is another reason the 40-day frame matters. It creates a clock. Humans react differently when pressure has a visible time frame. A campaign with no time marker feels abstract. A campaign with a 40-day window feels intentional. It invites people to watch the map, the fuel market, the blackouts, the airport closures, the official statements, and the Russian response. It turns the war into a countdown, and countdowns shape attention. But why 40 days exactly? Public reporting does not give us a full official explanation, and that gap has fueled a lot of speculation. Some see symbolism, some see summer operational planning, some think it is simply long enough to create compounding pressure, but short enough to sustain a high tempo. We should resist pretending we know more than public evidence shows. Still, even without knowing every reason, we can see what the number does politically. It tells supporters this is a campaign, not a stunt. It tells Russia this is meant to last. And it tells the world to watch the results, not just the announcement. Here is the darker side, though. Pressure campaigns work both ways. The more Ukraine strikes deep, the more the Kremlin can argue that Russia itself is under siege. That can be used to justify even more repression, even more mobilization of resources, and even harsher attacks on Ukraine. It can also be used to rally parts of the Russian public that might otherwise feel detached. Fear can weaken a state, but it can also make a state more brutal. So this campaign is not a magic key. It is a gamble, a serious one. The gamble is that Russia's vulnerabilities are now exposed enough that steady pressure will hurt more than retaliation helps. The gamble is that Russian logistics, energy infrastructure, and political messaging are more brittle than they look. The gamble is that the cost of continuing the war can be made visible not just to soldiers at the front, but to drivers, officials, tourists, business owners, and families deep behind the lines. And that is why this moment feels different. Not because the war suddenly became simple, but because the old geography of safety is breaking down. For years, modern states have relied on distance as comfort. If the front is far away, society keeps breathing. But drones, missiles, and long-range strike systems compress space. They erase the psychological border between battlefield and homeland. That is exactly what Ukraine is trying to do to Russia now. Not destroy the whole state in 40 days, not collapse an empire with one headline, make the war impossible to compartmentalize. That is a much more believable goal. And in some ways, it may be the more dangerous one. Because once daily life starts carrying the weight of war, politics changes. A delayed train is no longer just a delayed train. A fuel queue is no longer just a fuel queue. A blackout is no longer just a blackout. Each one becomes a question mark hanging over the government's promise that it can manage everything. And in authoritarian systems, the appearance of control is often almost as important as control itself. Now let's talk about what success would actually look like for Ukraine. Because this is where many people get fooled by dramatic language. Success does not have to mean Putin suddenly agrees to peace in a single month. Success could mean something smaller, but still important. It could mean forcing Russia to divert more defenses away from the front. It could mean worsening the fuel and logistics strain around Crimea. It could mean increasing financial pressure on energy infrastructure. It could mean raising the political cost of telling Russian citizens that everything is under control. It could mean showing allies that Ukrainian long-range strike capability is growing and worth supporting. Those are not small things. In a long war, those are exactly the kinds of shifts that matter. But failure also has forms. If Ukraine spends too much, loses too many scarce systems, or triggers heavier Russian attacks without creating enough strategic effect, then the campaign may still look bold while producing little lasting change. There is also the issue of sustainability. A high-intensity tempo sounds impressive for a week. Sustaining it is harder. Doing it while defending cities, stabilizing power systems, managing manpower, and keeping foreign support flowing is harder still. And support matters more than people think. Ukraine's pressure campaign does not exist in a vacuum. It depends on domestic production, intelligence, repair capacity, and continued backing from partners. The Guardian reported European support announcements around the same period, including new macro-financial aid and drone funding. That matters because long-range pressure is not just about bravery. It is about supply chains, electronics, manufacturing, training, targeting, and replacement rates. Strategy is not made of speeches alone. It is made of what can be sustained after the cameras move on. That is also why Russia will be watching not just the strikes, but the reaction. If Ukraine can keep the pace while keeping Allied support strong, Moscow has a problem. If Ukraine's partners hesitate, delay, or fragment, Moscow gains time. Every long campaign becomes a contest of endurance, not just of intent. And then there is the issue of narrative discipline. Ukraine has to be careful not to oversell what this campaign can achieve. The moment people start believing that one 40-day push will surely end the war, disappointment becomes dangerous. Strategic patience can survive hard truth. It struggles under inflated expectation. So the smartest way to understand this campaign is not as a promised ending, but as an attempt to reshape the conditions of the war. Ukraine is trying to widen the bill Russia must pay, not only at the front, but in oil, transport, electricity, tourism, local governance, public confidence, and air defense deployment. If you want more videos that connect the dots before everyone else catches up, subscribe now, hit like if this made you think, and share it with a friend who follows this war closely. Not only in occupied territory, but in regions Russians thought were far enough away to stay normal. Not only in military terms, but in emotional terms. And that last point matters most. Wars are fought with steel, but they are endured with belief. Belief that the cost is worth it. Belief that the state is competent. Belief that victory is still realistic. belief that ordinary life can continue. When those beliefs weaken, the pressure begins to multiply beyond the immediate damage. That is why footage from strikes matters so much online. It is not just spectacle, it is proof of reach. It is proof that distance no longer guarantees peace. It is proof that the side under invasion is still able to impose uncertainty on the invader. And uncertainty is corrosive. It changes how governors report upward. It changes how local officials prepare. It changes how people plan holidays, spending, and travel. It changes how families feel when air alerts hit a city they thought was untouchable. It changes how elites think about risk. The Kremlin may still control the narrative heavily, but repeated disruption keeps injecting reality into the story. So, can this 40-day campaign collapse Putin's war machine? If by collapse you mean instant breakdown, probably not. That is the part of the headline designed to thrill you. If by collapse you mean erode parts of the machinery that keep the war running smoothly, then yes, that is already happening in visible ways. If by collapse you mean prove that Russia cannot fully shield its rear, its oil system, Crimea, and its image of stability at the same time, then the evidence points in that direction too. If by collapse you mean create enough pressure to force new military and political choices in Moscow, that is exactly what Ukraine is trying to do. The bigger question is whether it can keep doing it long enough, hard enough, and smart enough. Because 40 days is not just a threat to Russia, it is also a test for Ukraine, a test of production, a test of precision, a test of intelligence, a test of stamina, a test of alliance support, a test of whether modern long-range pressure can do more than punish, whether it can actually bend strategy. And maybe that is the real story here. Not that Moscow suddenly burns and everything changes in one night, but that the war is entering another phase where the rear is no longer rear, distance is no longer safety, and control is no longer something the Kremlin can simply declare into existence. If that phase continues, Russia may not face one dramatic collapse. It may face something slower, more frustrating, and harder to contain. A growing inability to keep war, economy, logistics, and public calm all balanced at once. And sometimes that is how big systems begin to fail. Not with one final blow, but with accumulating strain that keeps returning every morning. So when you hear about a 40-day operation, do not think only about the explosions. Think about the quieter effects, the emptied stations, the diverted defenses, the broken schedules, the blackout warnings, the rising costs, the nervous officials, the shrinking space between the battlefield and daily life. That is where this campaign may matter most, because if Ukraine can keep turning Russia's depth into vulnerability, then the war stops being a story Moscow manages from a distance. It becomes a pressure Russia has to live with. And once a state has to live with the pressure every day, the most dangerous question is no longer whether the war can continue tomorrow. It is how long the system can keep pretending nothing essential is changing. The strongest wars are not always won by the side that looks loudest in a headline. They are often shaped by the side that learns how to make the other side feel the war where it thought it was safest. And right now, that is exactly the battle Ukraine is trying to fight.